Hi, it's Anna. Welcome back to Books on the Go. I've got the house to myself, so I thought I would quickly do a video while I have the opportunity. The kids are out. We're into, I think, week 7 of school holidays. So we're getting there. We're on the home stretch, but it's been hard to find time to make videos amongst everything else. So this is just a quick, I think, January wrap up. Let's do that and see how we go. And I also want to do a stellar long list predictions video. So I'll see if I can find time in the next day or two to do that, because that will be announced next week. So I've just got a pile of books that I think I read in January, and so apologies if there are any double ups, but let's see. The first one is Mateship with Birds by Carrie, Tiffany, and this one I was eager to read because I loved Exploded View, which we read on the podcast last year. So this is an earlier book, and it was the inaugural winner of the Stella Prize for women's writing in Australia. And I really enjoyed this. It's very different to Exploded View, but like that one, it has that real sense of place in Australia and in the countryside. All the characters are living in sort of outback or country town Australia, and the main character, the Harry, is, I've forgotten what his job is, but he's observing this Kookaburra family, among other things. He keeps a log of the birds outside his house. And so interspersed amongst the story is almost a poem of his observations of this Kookaburra family, which is really endearing. And then his neighbour is, what was her name? Betty, and her son Michael. So Betty's a single mother, and she's a wonderful character, beautifully depicted, just one of those quiet people who just go to work every day, don't really have leisure time, and just a really true character of a single mother in a country town Australia, and her son Michael. But Michael starts to go and visit Harry, who mentors him in the ways of the world. That sounds a bit wrong now that I say that. Interestingly, some people have commented they thought it was ambiguous in the way it depicted the relationship between Harry and Michael, but I didn't find that. I thought it was very beautifully done and very innocent, but it's interesting that it perhaps can be read different ways. So really, yes, a very good Australian book, and her writing is really strong, and I love the care she takes with her characters. So that is Mateship with Birds by Carrie, Tiffany. And I read Olive Again by Elizabeth Strout. And of course, last year, belatedly, I read Olive Kitteridge and absolutely loved it. And this is the sequel, and it's the same style of writing. So it's like a story cycle. So a series of short stories that all centre around the same town in Maine and all have Olive Kitteridge in them, whether she's the main character or she appears in the story. So it's different characters' lives, essentially. I didn't think it was as strong as Olive Kitteridge. I think it felt a bit longer and it didn't feel as tight. But again, I just love her writing, her observations, the small moments in life that she really brings to life, and the humanity of her writing, where she'll talk about, the good and bad things that can happen within families, not judging, but it feels hopeful by the end. So that was Olive Again. And then I read You Will Be Safe Here by Damien Barr, which I thought was fantastic. I went into it with a little bit of trepidation because I thought the story sounded quite sad or quite confronting. So partly it's set in South Africa around the time of the Boer War, and then it also has a modern day setting where a boy is sent away to a camp. But actually it wasn't that bleak at all. Well, I didn't find it so. There are certainly some bleak moments, and of course there are some confronting scenes, but for the most part it's just so engaging. The characters are wonderful, the dialogue is really spot on, and the story is really interesting. So I went into this not knowing anything about the Boer War, and it was interesting actually. Damien Barr comments, I think there's an author's note or at some point he comments that it's no longer taught in schools in England or in the UK or in South Africa. And of course, I wasn't taught it at school. It was something I really didn't know much about at all. So that really enlightened me. It puts you in these concentration camps that the South Africans were sent to. And that was, again, that is a grim storyline, but this character Sarah is a great character. And what I liked about it was it then switches. So just when you think, oh, I don't know how long I can stay in the concentration camp, it then switches and you get the modern day setting, and you have Willem, who's a fabulous character as well, and his journey where he gets sent away to this camp, and the very nuanced dynamic between his mother, his mother, and her boyfriend. And I really liked that. And there's a lot sort of between the lines, I think, about masculinity in South Africa and the history, and then I suppose the aftermath of those wars and what it has meant, how that's played out. And so, yeah, really, really good read. I recommend that. That's You Will Be Safe Here by Damien Barr, who is coming to Adelaide Writers' Week next month. So that's exciting. And then I read, and this was the Costa shortlist, I think, for the best novel, Shadowplay by Joseph O'Connor. Is that right? Yes. So this, I think Kim Forrester recommended this to me, and also I'd seen it on the Costa shortlist and it just sounded interesting. I've never read Joseph O'Connor before, but I really enjoyed it. So it's set in London around the 1800s, it must be. Yes, 1878. And it centres around Bram Stoker, who went on to write Dracula, and Sir Henry Irving, who was the greatest Shakespearean actor of his era, and Ellen Terry, who was the greatest actress of her era at the leading lady and most lauded actress of her generation. So there's three fabulous characters, and it's when Henry Irving sets up the Lyceum Theatre, and Bram Stoker manages the theatre, but he's trying to write and establish a career as an author, moonlighting as an author, I suppose, writing at night up in this spooky attic. And Ellen Terry, who floats in and out, and there are some really poignant moments later in their lives, scenes with Ellen Terry as well, which I actually thought were beautifully done, very moving. But there are some laugh out loud scenes when they're in the theatre, and it feels so true. It just has that real sense. I think if you have spent any time around theatres or actors and anything like that, you would really enjoy it. There's a lot of fun there. But it also has a real sense of place. It has some gothic elements. So there's humour. The characters are beautifully portrayed. I found it's a bit vignette-y because he structures it that way. So it's Bram Stoker saying to Ellen, here are some bits and pieces. You asked me for my memories of our time together, and here they are. Some of it's fictionalised, some of it's my diary notes, and so on. So that's the structure of the book. So it does have that slightly disconnected at times, or slightly episodic, I suppose, but really, really fun and well written, and at times funny, at times poignant. So I recommend this, and it's very much if you're in the mood for a London book and or for a gothic book, or something that will make you think of Charles Dickens or Wilkie Collins and that sort of flavour, it's a really good read. So that's Shadowplay. Then A Moth to a Flame by Stig Dagerman. So we did this for the podcast, and I bought myself one and one for Amanda because we love the Penguin European Writers series, and I have enjoyed all of the ones that I've read and loved a couple of them. And this is a Swedish author, Stig Dagerman, who was regarded as the most talented writer of the Swedish post-war generation. He died young. He took his own life at 31 in 1954, so very young. And I think this is set in the 1940s, and it was published so this was first published in 1948. and set in the 1940s in Sweden. And the premise is that a boy, or teenage boy, his mother dies and his father gets together with another woman, and he's really angry about it, but then he falls under her spell. And it says that, he tries to take revenge, but then embarks on a forbidden affair with her, which I thought sounded very intriguing. And it actually, for me, this felt very slow. So I went into reading it with high expectations, and it seemed to take so long for anything to happen. So I decided I would start skim reading it because I really wasn't loving it. And so I'd skim a few pages and think, the danger of skimming is that you miss key moments or you miss stuff, apart from missing out on the writing. And so I'd skim through, and then I'd worry that I'm missing something, and then I'd find that it's still the same scene and they're still walking to the bakery or whatever it was, they're still on the train. And so it seemed to drag on for me. So it was not my favourite of this series, but it is a very interesting book. I think if you were in a more patient mood, the writing is quite good in a matter-of-fact way. It feels very honest, and it's just, if you're in the mood for a book about a young man who is tempestuous, who is immature, self-centered, if you're in the mood for something like that and to see what will happen, you will enjoy the sort of unraveling and the slow sort of disaster, I suppose, and the nuances of all these relationships. And it's nice in the sense that it's not judgmental, it's not judging any of the characters. But he was unlikable, and that would be okay if it's moving along quickly and you can enjoy the story, but the story was moving so slowly. And I thought it very much felt, I don't know if it was semi-autobiographical at all, but it felt very much, you get the perspective of a young man or a coming of age of a young man, and not so much the woman character. I couldn't quite work out where she was coming from. And his father was quite well drawn, but yes, this didn't quite work for me. That's A Moth to a Flame, but I'd be interested if any of you have read it. Let me know what you thought. I absolutely loved There Was Still Love by Favel, Parrett. So I had heard about it. I'm really annoyed with myself because Favel, Parrett came to Adelaide. I think she's coming to Writers' Week, so I'll catch her there. But she came to promote this book and I missed it. And then Heather Rose recommended it, and so I thought I'll pick it up, and I'm so glad I did because it was just a gorgeous story. So I read just before this the Milan Kundera, The Book of Laughter and Forgetting, and so I was in Czechoslovakia, and this one was a nice, I wondered if it would work to read them close together, and it did, I think, because it was a very nice, very different perspective, but it was a follow-on story, if you like, where you've got a family in Czechoslovakia in the 1930s, and then some of them moved to Melbourne, and so you have an older couple in Melbourne in 1980 and their granddaughter, and then you go back to her sister in Prague in 1980 and her grandson. And so it's a beautiful book about the relationship between children and their grandparents, with some wonderful older women characters and a sense of the place. So you have a sense of Prague and this wonderful scene that opens the chapter with the boy, where is he? Ludek. I'm terrible with the names. This wonderful scene that opens with Ludek running through the streets of Prague, and he's just a gorgeous character. And then the Melbourne scenes are very true to life as well, about the experience of being an immigrant and being away from home and that sense of exile. And then there are moments where they all come together because the older couple in Melbourne travel back to Prague periodically. And then there's a sort of subplot involving Ludek's mother and what's become of her. So I must say by the end, I wasn't entirely clear, and I probably didn't concentrate well enough about what his mother was doing or not doing, but it didn't matter because I just loved being with the characters, and getting just a sense of that experience. So I really recommend this, and it's an easy read. So There Was Still Love by Favel Parrett. Then some more Australian books. So Dark Emu by Bruce Pascoe, and we just did this for the podcast. This is not a retelling, but this is another side of Australian history that until now we haven't been taught very much, and Bruce Pascoe is uncovering and using white settlers' diary notes and journal entries, the story of what pre-colonial Aboriginal society looked like in reality. So what we've been told and brought up with is that it was empty land, and there were some Aboriginal people who were very much just merely hunter-gatherers, so very much a subsistence sort of society, and that the white settlers came in and brought civilization to the country, and to justify their sort of invading and colonising Australia, they had to show, or they had to say, that it was really empty, that it didn't have a structured society living there, which we know isn't true. But it's never quite, the Australian narrative and our history is quite distorted in the sense that we know it's not true. We've had native title now only since the 1990s, but there have been now cases where that has been restored, and lots of elements are starting to come together. We've had the apology some years ago, but it's still very distorted in the sense that it is based on a lie that, there was this empty land. And Bruce Pascoe talks about the agriculture system, so the fact that Aboriginal people had very sophisticated farming techniques, aquaculture, they built houses, they had very good ideas about land management, and they controlled fire. And that's, of course, very topical now because we've had the bushfires sweeping across the country. And so there's a chapter on fire, which is very, very relevant today. But he talks about just the landscape and how they managed the land in a sustainable way. So, for example, sheep and cattle, which were introduced by the Europeans, trample and compact the soils, graze everything, such that then you can't do proper controlled fires. Then the plants that we could be eating can't grow properly, and so on. And the fencing that also has an impact. Whereas kangaroos jump very lightly on the soil, and that's a more sustainable food if you're wanting to eat red meat. So that's just one example that I thought was really interesting. So the positive thing about the book is that, and he's very balanced in the way he presents all this, but there's this history that we haven't been aware of that we really need to acknowledge, but there's also the positive side, which is that we can use this information and change the way that we manage our land and what sort of foods we eat and so on. So I really think this is it's a very deeply important book, but it's a must read. But it's also very engaging, easy to read, and it's one of those books that you learn something on every page, and well written. So I highly recommend this, especially obviously if you're in Australia, but it's an interesting read for anyone who's interested in Australia. And of course, we're not the only country that this sort of thing has happened. So you'll probably find parallels in the States and Canada and other parts of the world. So really good read. That's Dark Emu. And then one that I had very high hopes for, The Yield by Tara June Winch. So this was Annie's book of the year last year. And we've just recorded our podcast episode, which will go up next week. I think it will be in the stellar long list. It's the story of an Aboriginal woman. Tara June Winch is an Aboriginal author, and it's the story of a young woman who is living in London and comes back to Australia because her grandfather has passed away, and finds that there's a mining company that wants to take her parents' land. And so she gets involved in this argument, and to stay on the land, they have to show they've had a continuous connection with that land. And she doesn't know if they can prove that. But meanwhile, her grandfather had been writing a dictionary of their language that they were losing because there's a history of white settlers coming in and banning Aboriginal people from speaking their own language. and forcing them to learn English, which she explores a bit in this. And so you get sections that are from the grandfather's dictionary, which I really enjoyed. And then sections of August is her name, and her, the current day battle that she's fighting. And then you get sections which are the Reverend writing letters from when he was running the mission in her grandfather's day, where they took Aboriginal children and looked after them and educated them, and sometimes very well intentioned. And so for me, this didn't work, I'm afraid. Annie absolutely loved it, and it's had rave reviews, so don't be put off. I think I just was feeling too impatient. I also was comparing it with Too Much Lip by Melissa Lukashenko, which I loved and had a lot of energy and had a great story. This felt very slow, and it just took so long for anything to happen, and I loved parts of it, and some of her writing is very poetic, but it just didn't come together for me. So I didn't read through the whole thing. I sort of skimmed a bit to see if it got better. But for me, no. But I think for the stellar judges, the chair of the judges, Louise Swin, wrote an absolutely glowing review in Sydney Morning Herald. So I have no doubt it will do well in the Stella Prize, and it is a beautifully written book. So give it a try and let me know what you thought if you've read it. And that's it for my January wrap up. Let me know what you've been reading, and I will see you soon. Bye for now.